What we're talking about in terms of like military and being able to delegate to decision making in the field, that's actually what I think people don't understand is that's actually very American. If you go throughout history, other countries don't have that. You're talking about Russia today. If you go into World War II, that's a big reason for German problems, everything like that. It's a very American and British kind of philosophy of empowering the people in the field. But I want to come back to your point around, I didn't know this about the aircraft carrier commanders, where they're originally pilots and then they make them go off and do other things. And other industries do that, right? There's an awful lot. For example, at GE, it's had a number of famous CEOs, and apparently, when you get given the job as being the CEO of GE, the first job you are given by the board is you need to now find your successor, your eventual successor. That's your number one priority. And they intentionally make people, they identify some people who might be the candidates 10 years ahead, and they send them off and make them go and do other things that they're maybe not as strong at and things like that. So to your point around the aircraft carrier, you were a pilot, now you're going to go off and do these other things and learn these other things. Let's transfer that to the wealth management world. Let's say you're the CEO of a large wealth management firm. You've maybe got multiple partners at your firm. There's a real strong next generation coming through. You identify there's maybe one or two like potential future leaders within your organization. And right now they're advisors and they're rainmakers and they're killing it and they're doing great. How should a CEO like prepare that kind of future leader? Like, because it's like there's only so many parts to a wealth management firm. We don't have a supply chain, well, we do, but it's more like technological and things like that. Like, what advice would you bring to people focusing on that next generation of leaders that they want to bring through?
Well, the metaphor you had of GE as they develop their next CEO is a great example. And it's, by the way, great companies across industries develop their professionals. In other words, if you look at, technology firms, biotech firms, manufacturing firms, an individual who joins the organization in their leadership development track is going to be in different jobs, and they know that they're going to be in different jobs. They're going to have a rotation in finance, because they need to be able to understand the financial mechanisms of the company. They may have a rotation in sales. They may have a rotation in operational leadership in companies that have multiple facets like that. Financial services, it's been interesting that you do see increasingly in some of the larger firms, there is this idea of developing someone by giving them these experience in different areas. Mm-hmm. But there's so much of a oversimplification in financial services that the skill set that matters is the ability to sell and the ability to make rain. And what's interesting about that is that skill set of being able to sell and make rain is very much an immediate activity in this moment. If I'm selling, I'm interacting with another person, and I'm at some level in the process of a decision managing or influencing their decision making. That's a high skill. What you find when you start talking to CEOs who have evolved from being a great rainmaker, and now because they were a great rainmaker, the assumption is that they can lead and develop an organization, which means that they're now, because they could sell or because they could make rain and influence the incoming of new business, that singular task of a much larger range of tasks, because it's so important, is the only thing that matters for equipping somebody to do that job. And I would suggest, just like the naval aviator illustration, being able to fly an airplane and knowing what it takes to fly an airplane and then knowing how to command a wing
Mhm.
is a necessary, very high skill and should be part of the essential part of the preparation for doing that. However, driving an aircraft carrier and operating on a battlefield is not the same as flying an airplane and dealing with an immediate interaction with an airplane. It's not the same thing.
Yeah.
And I think as a cautionary word in our industry, putting somebody in a position because they know how to sell and then they spend all of their time looking at the organization and saying, how well are we selling? Then begs the question, am I looking critically at how well are we deploying our knowledge about how to build investment models? And are we evolving that so that what we're offering, our value proposition in investments, is evolving and meeting our clients at their point of need as their needs meet? What company will we be 5 years from now or 10 years from now? And what resources are we going to need? Are we properly staffed? Are we managing our humans effectively so that we get the most out of them? These are all very different skills. And what happens in financial services is when you walk into an organization where you have a CEO who has not been through a process of multiple or many experiences of understanding the complexity of what it takes for an organization to move forward and achieve at a very high level, they tend to look at the world in a similar way. You know, there's an old saying, if the only tool you have in your toolbox is a hammer, everything tends to look like a nail.
Mhm.
And that means that a lot of the stuff that needs to happen in an organization, how human beings are developed, do we have a methodology, for example, of developing rainmakers? You know from your experience at Dynasty that one of the biggest challenges organizations have is they have a couple of people who've been really good at rainmaking. Almost always one of them has moved into a position of leadership. We have a whole lot of other people who want to develop in that, and we figure out how to hire somebody that looks right. We throw them into the role, but we don't know how to tell them what to do. And because training and professional development and coaching and skill development is not often the strength of that CEO who came up successfully and was a great rainmaker. No, don't hear a criticism or a limitation there. But because those aspects of managing humans were seen as a secondary or less important level. You know, the director of training is never paid like the head of sales, right? That's a scale of significance as the company sees it. Now what you have are individuals who your organization is not able to evolve the way it needs to because we don't have any attention paid or skills applied to or knowledge about or understanding of how do we develop these people. And that's just one example of it, you know, so that are we looking at this and say if we're selling, but what is happening is we're not managing to whom we're selling. Now we have the situation where since we're not managing who our clients are, we're selling to everybody, and now we have a lot of small clients and not as many of the kind of premier clients that we want. And you and I could go through 1,000 such observations, but it comes back to, at its root, does the CEO have a conscious awareness that their tendency will always be to narrow their frame of reference? And when they do that, and the key to understanding scope as a challenge in mindset is that when the brain narrow frames, it functionally edits out of awareness, completely out of awareness, the other information in the environment that may be significant in terms of other priorities of functioning in that space. So an example of this, I saw an interview with a Ukrainian colonel who was training soldiers and putting them through some pretty scary experiences and rigorous experiences that tested them to a pretty significant level. And he said, look, what we know in terms of military preparation is your performance in combat will degrade to your level of training. We
Yeah.
need to
Yeah.
create a foundation below which you don't degrade. Well, part of that is narrow framing. If the person in combat is so focused on the threat that they forget what their role is and how they're to participate with their fellow warriors, you're degrading down below the level of where your effectiveness is. Now that's a perfect metaphor for the CEO, because it's natural, and this is the whole point of this conversation, Gordon. It's natural for the brain to narrow frame. It wants to narrow frame. It feels better when it narrow frames. It feels like it's protecting you when it narrow frames. And the challenge then is that you can feel very much like you're doing the right thing when you're editing out of awareness a lot of the other stuff. And that looks a lot of different ways, that, yeah, I know that's important. We'll need to get around to it, but this is the most important thing right now. And the CEO who's in the CEO mindset knows that the moment of saying, yeah, that's, we'll get around to that, that's not important, that's not as critical, blah, blah, knows that when their brain starts to do that, they're potentially making a mistake, and they stop and they say, wait a second, am I missing something?
Yeah.
Am I rushing to a decision? Am I dismissing the importance of this?
Yeah, and it's interesting because one of the things we get asked an awful lot on is how, if I'm a CEO and there's multiple partners at my firm, how do I hold the other partners accountable, right? And one of the things that we advocate is, in order to be a partner at your firm, you can't just be narrow focused. You have to show the way. You have to be able to manage things and produce results at a wider lens. So one of the things we very much advocate is you can't just be a rainmaker. You have to be in charge of something else in order to be a partner at your firm. And that can be anything. It can be training. It can be you're the chief decision maker on marketing strategy or something like that. You have to kind of diversify on that. So I think this is a topic that firms really have to kind of pay attention to.
Well, they do, Gordon, because the whole point that you're making there is, it's by virtue of you being a great rainmaker and understanding the marketing, and then 2 years from now, then handing marketing over to somebody else, and then taking on the training piece, and then 2 years from now taking the training piece and then handling maybe the financial management and the supervision of the accounting processes. That person who's doing that is doing what the aircraft carrier commander or the battle group commander is doing. Is, while a critical piece of what we need to be able to do and what I need to learn and manage and pay attention to is rainmaking. These other pieces are essential for this organization. And in fact, our rainmaking activity may need for me not to be paying attention to it because our marketing activities are weak or are obsolete, haven't evolved, haven't chased after excellence properly. And that needs a lot of focus and learning how to shift those gears and the pain of shifting those gears. Because what I'm trying to sensitize our listeners to is how much the brain doesn't want to have to cope with that much effort. What Kahneman says in this book, Thinking Fast and Slow, is this slow thinking brain, this very deliberate, logical, analytical, mathematical, language-based brain moves really slowly, and it consumes an enormous amount of effort thinking through a marketing plan. Again, I'll give you an example. I have worked with many teams, including their CEO or pivotal leader, around unique value proposition. And I'll come in and I'll say, what is your current unique value proposition? And they'll give me some kind of generalized description. Oh, we want to be the chief financial officer for wealthy families. That's not a unique value proposition. That's maybe an elevator pitch. I'll sit down and say, okay, let's look at how to create a UVP. And for a CEO, this should be a fundamental element of constant attention at some point. is our UVP effective? Is it expressing who we intend to be? And are we programmed internally and organized internally to fulfill the promise of what a UVP is, right?
Yeah.
We'll start by saying, okay, who's your target clientele? And we'll start to chew on that, and they'll say, well, pre-retirees. No, let's get more specific. And what happens is we need to get more specific about who the target clientele is. We need to get really specific about what their unmet needs or not understood needs are, or unknown needs are. And then we need to figure out what our response to that is. And then we need to figure out how to message it. And what happens is the attention span and the engagement of the group wanes, because the effort involved in actually creating a high quality UVP that's going to drive the success of the organization, while I would contend it's one of the more important things for you to get in place and evolve regularly, most organizations won't go through the pain of staying focused on it and doing the work, the hard work of going really deep. And so, and a great example of this is, I will show up in an office somewhere, and I've been asked to do a talk on one of our, Advisor Institute programs. And our programs are, all based on psychological insights, but all designed to help organizations solve key practice management issues. And I'll show up and I'll say, okay, you're having a meeting, your folks are all in the room, and let's talk about target marketing and UVP. Everybody should have a UVP. And so I'll show up and I'll say, okay, so how long do you want me to speak? Well, keep it to 15 minutes. Right? What is that telling you? We got to be out selling. We got to be out selling. And I'm like, I get it. I'm not disagreeing with that. But that is somebody who's narrow framing and saying the only amount of attention we can pay to this is in these 15 minutes, and give us 2 really shallow insights.
Yeah.
And that somehow will address the problem. And in that moment, you see the individual narrow framing, indulging that. It's a natural tendency. It's not like I'm criticizing it. It's inevitable for the human being. The general officer who is, commanding the battlefront, if the general officer, for example, discovers that we've got a supply chain issue, the general officer may delegate the actual battlefield management, because the criticality of the supply issues may actually threaten the success of the mission, and knows that, well, my original expertise was tank command or infantry command and the movement of pieces. We've got to fix this supply chain issue. And actually, as you commented earlier, in the early stages of the engagement in Ukraine, what was beginning to be revealed was that senior commanders who actually were trying to hold an awareness of local issues with the bigger picture were on the front lines trying to manage what was happening, and were being picked off by the Ukrainian military, because they were in a place where they were vulnerable because the operation wasn't organized. And that's essentially what happens if your CEO can't manage scope. Where's the right scope right now for what's happening in the building?
Yeah. Is it final tangent, and then I'll get on to our final question because we're running out of time. Just this concept of how much effort it takes to see the grand vision. Apparently, and I don't know if this is true or not, but I read it on the internet, so it must be true. Apparently, chess grandmasters, during their matches, and a grandmaster chess match is like 5 hours of them sitting in a seat or something like that.
Right.
Apparently, chess grandmasters burn like 6,000 calories during a chess match, because they have to see the whole board. The brain consumes that much energy seeing the whole board, which is like 6,000 calories is about the same as like doing a Tour de France stage. It's crazy, because it takes the body that much effort to kind of think strategically and see the whole board. Final question, because we're running out of time. We've talked an awful lot today about decision making and the vision, and it's all kind of very much front focused. There is an input into this process, which is information, right? And I want to make sure we cover this question because what information is incoming into this decision-making process is important, because we get asked an awful lot, what metrics should I pay attention to? What information should I pay attention to as I'm running my organization? And in the advisor role, it's very linear. It's net new assets. It's how many clients do I have? It's what's performance returns, that type of thing. It's very narrow. With a company, it's wider. So what's your thoughts in terms of that change in the information gathering?
Well, at the most basic level, if you're the CEO of an organization, you need to have a dashboard of information that's measuring the critical aspects of your business so that you can see trends and become alerted by this big picture measurement where attention needs to be paid in a more granular level. That a dashboard is how you can see the big picture and then move in and be in the right place at the right time based on the indicators. Most organizations do not have good dashboards. Now, part of that challenge is that
not all organizations work with Dynasty.
Well, how do you get good data from the field? But I mean, one of the most fundamental insights about leadership and management, and I think it was it Tom Stanley, or maybe it was one of the, like Peter Drucker, one of the big management consultants, said, look, if you're not measuring it, you're not managing it. You can't manage what you're not measuring. So in terms of scope, one of the things you see as a very simple example of this, Gordon, is one of the things you see organizations doing is they track their assets under management and they track their revenue, right?
Yeah.
And it's assets under management, revenue, that's all we need to know. And we know you're succeeding because your assets under management are up and your revenue's up. Well, there's a lot of variables that go in financial services to assets under management and revenues being up. And I know a lot of advisors in different market conditions that enjoyed asset increase and revenue increase because of the way they were charging their clients and because of what had happened in the capital markets. That does not mean that your practice is succeeding. It's an illusion because you're not measuring the right things. You're not measuring what is your net new acquisition. What is your net regretted attrition? What is the average age of your clientele? What is the average age of your new client, right? So when I start to work with organizations and say, okay, what are you measuring and how is it? What are your first actions in rainmaking that are the stimulant to your rainmaking methodology? Do you even have rainmaking methodology? When I'm working in asset management setting and I have a lot of wholesalers on our team, we'll have great years based on one anomalous large transaction that was accidentally, stimulated because one of our products is having a great run, and somebody in one of their financial advisors said, oh, we had a guy sell his business and we're going to drop 30 million into this sleeve. My philosophy about that is we should wash out of everybody's business in our business and asset management their biggest transaction and their shortest transaction, and then look at their
interesting
their activity in that regard. With financial advisors, I say, tell me about your methodology. What is your first action in your methodology of rainmaking? And how many first actions are you doing? Are you doing enough of them? And in our Bernstein organization, there's one of the things they measure is how many meetings with COIs are you doing weekly? And they establish a minimum threshold for those types of meetings, because the meetings with COIs are early stage stimulants to the methodology they use for client acquisition. So a CEO should have a broad range of measurements coming in from the firm that are tied to indicators that our organization is succeeding. I've mentioned a couple of times that I'm very familiar with the business model up in Bridgewater, Ray Dalio's company.
Yeah.
They have a very robust 30% turnover rate annually of key employees. So they lose a lot of people within a year and a half, or 2 years of joining the organization. And this is by design because of the process of development and how they manage them. They are teaching them how to participate in the decision-making process, and about 70% of people can learn it and about 30% of people can't, and they really try to select, but they've come to the conclusion that the best they can get to is a 30% attrition rate.
Huh.
In some organizations, that would be an indicator of a problem that needed to be fixed. In this organization, it's an indicator that our process is working because we're maintaining this consistent 30%. And what I'm saying to you is that each organization will have to come up with an idiosyncratic set of measurements. But the point of that, Gordon, and to your point about our time being up, the point of that is so that CEO can manage scope. So in that case, that dashboard provides this big picture across a wide range of data. They can get an intuitive sense of 80% of what I want to see is more or less there. Our trends in these areas are in the right direction. There's 2 areas here that are not consistent. And maybe 6 months ago, my big issue was we weren't doing enough new rainmaking engagements, but we fixed that. We paid attention to it and we fixed it. We drove leadership energy into that. That was hard. That's now trending properly. Now I can turn my attention to a lesser but still important area of the business, and that's managing scope. Can look out at the big picture, see where I need to intervene, where do resources need to go. To your point about the chess master, that CEO's doing that is being highly effective and is exhausted at the end of the day, because that is all slow thinking, highly disciplined, applying their best thinking to the challenge of running the business. And again, talking about this means, and we're simply saying to CEOs that are listening to this, this is what you should aspire to in developing yourself. You're always going to be called into this narrow framing. It's a natural reaction. Here's what the excellent leaders in the military and other corporations and in financial services do. That's different. That's the mindset shift we're looking for our evolving leaders.
Excellent, excellent. Unfortunately, time has been our enemy today, Ken, but this was a really enjoyable conversation. We went on a number of different tangents there, but I think the audience will view it as time well spent. But Ken, thank you so much as always for your input and your time on this. Thank you to everyone who are listening in. As always, if you want to talk about any of the topics that are covered in these conversations, please feel free to come back to Dynasty here, either your relationship manager or Ken and myself here. More than happy to talk about this further. Thank you so much, everyone, and thank you, Ken.